These are crucial times for humanity. We're living through the birthing pains of a clean energy revolution. One that, if done right, promises an end to fossil fuel pollution and to the impending climate breakdown that we all want to avoid. And of course, what's not to like about a clean energy revolution? We all want clean energy to power our homes, our computers, our phones, and our transport. It holds enormous promise, but we are fast running out of time. To avert climate catastrophe, the scale and the speed of this just energy transition will have to be unprecedented. The world needs $5 trillion of investment every year for the next 5 years to make sure, in renewable energy, to ensure that we can avoid that climate change. Our clean energy future also needs the batteries and the electric motors and the power lines, and that will take an unprecedented investment in transition minerals and their extraction from the earth, alongside, of course, their recycling. The International Energy Agency tells us that the world needs 6 times more of these minerals out of the ground by 2040. And here's the catch, because there's always a catch. The reality is that boom in mining and renewable energy installation will take vast areas of land. And the question is, whose land will that be? Now, for many indigenous peoples and marginalized communities, they fear that the answer from governments and companies will increasingly be their land. Because since the very first waves of colonization, indigenous peoples have been robbed of their fertile lands, and they've been moved into arid lands, now good for solar power, into the infertile uplands, now good for wind energy, and into the most broken river valleys, now good for the generation of hydroelectricity. And the Institute of Sustainable Minerals in Australia estimates that more than half of our mineral base for these transition minerals is located in or near the indigenous territories of our world. Now, from the Andes to the Congo River Basin to the Arctic, these international mining and energy companies have a long and troubled history of riding roughshod over the rights of workers and communities. While there are laudable exceptions, the majority have generated enormous legacies of distrust from communities. From bitter experiences, these communities simply do not want these companies anywhere near them. There's a legacy of distrust. These companies have entrenched cultures of tolerating abuse and environmental despoliation. In response to that, of course, indigenous cultures have built a culture of resistance. From bitter experience, they simply do not want these companies anywhere near them. So if we continue with the extraordinary speed of the energy transition we require, but these companies do not dramatically change their business model, we're going to end up with a massive expansion of abuse and with it a massive expansion of resistance, which will lead to an impasse which will benefit none of us. That's why we are calling, with our allies and partners around the world, for a just energy transition. One that will protect rights, that will build public support, the kind of public support that we need to ensure that we can get the speed of implementation to avoid climate breakdown. Now, at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, we take up over 1,000 allegations of abuse a year. We work with hundreds of communities and with investors and companies to build the global database that's free and public on human rights in business. But the evidence from this database demonstrates that communities and workers are right to be concerned about the behaviour of these companies that are now intimately involved in the fast transition we require. Because in that value chain of the clean energy, we start with the extraction of transition minerals. So we set up the Transition Mineral Tracker. And the Transition Mineral Tracker is there to monitor the human rights performance of the companies and their impact. We identified 500 allegations of abuse by these companies over the last 10 years. It includes land grabs, water grabs, pollution events, the violation of Indigenous people's rights, but also when Indigenous leaders and human rights defenders speak up about this abuse, too often they're silenced by lawsuits or threats or violence or even murder. And at the other end of this extraordinary clean energy supply chain is, of course, the installation of renewable energy. And so we set up the Renewable Energy Benchmark. And that Renewable Energy Benchmark assesses the largest companies involved in the installation of renewable energy around the world and judges them against the international standards of the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. What the benchmark reveals is effectively that these companies simply do not have in place the policies and practices in human rights and Indigenous rights that will guarantee they can play a fully constructive role in a just energy transition. Indigenous people face extraordinary risks of abuse. There are frequent violations, even of their most precious rights, such as their right to withhold or grant their consent for investments on their land. There are a handful of leading companies that do already now respect Indigenous people's rights. Let's name them: Iberdrola, EDP, Acciona Energy, and a few others. But the majority have none of that and cannot be therefore held accountable for the violations. And not one of the companies has policies that protect human rights defenders when they speak out. Now, to be clear, workers and communities are not against a transition. Workers want decent work, and they want it in industrial sectors with a future. And Indigenous people need a fast transition because they're often the first and worst affected. Witness what's happening now in the Arctic and the tropics. But when the cost of that transition is the effective extinction of their nation by companies taking over their last territories, there will be no deal. There will be no transition. There will be an impasse. And again, an impasse that benefits none of us. And these clashes are already happening. We are witnessing through our research an increase in the challenges that communities are making to these transition mineral companies and across the world, from the Philippines to Zimbabwe to Peru to the United States. And in renewable energy, communities such as those in northern Kenya, the Turkana people, are successfully challenging major renewable projects which promise to generate vast amounts of power, but with not a dribble entering their own communities and homes. Now, their resistance is not spurred by some kind of climate denial. When I was in Turkana for the first time 20 years ago, the leaders there then were already speaking eloquently about their fears of climate change that was bringing aridity and threatening their pastoralist livelihoods. Rather, their resistance is spurred by companies' failures to consult, their failure to seek consent, their failure to take seriously the concerns of communities, and their failure to share the economic benefits with the custodians of the land. Now, each of these mistakes has consequences. Consequences for vulnerable and poor people around the world, consequences for the sustainability of the transition, but also consequences for the costs that are attached to the companies. In the case of Rio Tinto, for instance, their lithium mine in Serbia, this has been opposed and halted by ferocious opposition from communities. And that's after Rio Tinto had sunk over $500 million in that project. So what does a just transition to clean energy look like? Well, at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, we have consulted widely around the world on this issue. And we believe there are 3 core principles that are necessary. The first is shared prosperity. Investments must be shaped and structured so that they build public support, so that they create buy-in from communities and workers. Through co-ownership models, for instance, that ensure and guarantee there is benefit to those custodians of the land. Secondly, there must be social protection and human rights. Companies have a duty of care to shield communities and workers from harm, to demonstrate due diligence that will mitigate the risks that communities face, and to provide remedy if things go wrong. And thirdly, there needs to be consultation and consent. Communities need to know that there will be respectful negotiations, where their rights to grant or withhold consent will be upheld, and where their leaders will not face threats and attacks if they dissent. So how do we get there? Well, we need leading companies demonstrating the good sense of building trust and reducing risk. We need more assertive governments that will reward responsible business conduct and punish pollution and abuse. And we need a civil society movement that's united to put social justice at the heart of the transition. The good news is that there's global progress, incipient but progress in all of these areas. Regarding the companies, the Resource Centre scours the planet looking for better practice, even best practice, in any particular area that we're concerned about, including the just transition. And companies like Bullfrog Power in Canada, or the First Nations Clean Energy Network in Australia, and the Kipeto Energy in Kenya. These are all pioneering companies demonstrating new business models where they work side by side with the communities in the design, the development, and the implementation of these projects. And crucially, they ensure that the communities get their fair share of the benefits through those co-ownership and co-equity models. Now, while it's early days, hopefully these extraordinary examples will be there for wider replication later. And regarding the more assertive action by governments, again, there is good news. The Sierra Leonean government last year brought in new laws that provide real leadership. They insist that mining companies must gain the consent of communities before they break ground to generate new mines. Now, that effectively puts a veto in the hands of the communities against irresponsible or unwanted investment. It also fundamentally changes the dynamic of the negotiation. And the European Union, to move to the north, the European Union is driving human rights and environmental due diligence in the supply chains and operations of European companies. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is due to be approved this year, will fundamentally change the calculus of risk in boardrooms regarding the toleration of human rights abuse and ecological damage in their operations and supply chains. Because irresponsible companies that do not will face mounting legal risk as well as severe penalties. Now, alongside that regulation, we also need state-led industrial policy and new business incentives to drive markets in the right direction. And here the United States is leading with $370 billion of investment over the next 5 years that's already changing the energy landscape of that country. But of course, many less wealthy nations cannot quite afford that scale of government investment. So here's where we need new finance vehicles. Things like perhaps the just energy transition partnerships that are being developed for nations that are high emitters but also heavily dependent on coal and oil. Here we gain public funds from richer nations to use to de-risk and to crowd in other investment sources in that just transition in those critical countries. Now, this is not without risk, but if those three principles of the just transition can be embedded within those partnerships, there is every reason for success. And of course, the third big need is the united and determined action of civil society. And here we have indigenous nations, trade unions, the youth movement, the women's movement. We have philanthropists, the green, human rights and development movements that are coming increasingly together. And they're joined now increasingly by companies and by investors and even governments who see the need for us to act and speak together to drive this just energy transition. Because our prize is that fast and fair transition that we require, one that will build shared prosperity and shared climate security. A win-win-win outcome. A win for workers and communities who will gain new sources of revenue, new livelihoods and decent work. The win for the companies and the investors who will gain that cooperative and stable investment environment that they need for long-term value and profit generation. And finally, a win for our planet, our lovely planet, with fast action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and thus prevent the climate breakdown that threatens us all, and instead move to a brighter future.